Well, hello, Rivers Crossing Church. Thank you so much. As you know, we're in a 4-week series on family, and that can be challenging, and we're leaning into the mess that family can be sometimes. We know that family is not easy, but family is messy, and when we're coming to family topics from a realistic standpoint, we know that we have to embrace the mess a little bit. So we wanted to take these 4 weeks and sit down with an expert to give us some feedback. So this is my lovely wife, Tina Pocock, who has degrees in sociology, in social work, more licenses than I could mention, endless training, does therapy primarily for families. So we have a couple topics we wanted to hit. We're going to take these one episode at a time. So welcome to episode 1. We're going to be talking about conflict and fun. The reason I wanted to bring up conflict for our first one is because when I first asked you about this podcast months ago, I said, hey, you tell me, you hadn't even agreed to be a part of it yet. And I was like, hey, if we do this podcast for this series, what's one topic that we definitely cannot skip? And you replied instantly, conflict.
Right.
Why were you so passionate and so quick to say, you got to talk about conflict when you talk about families?
I think conflict is always something that either brings us together or divides us. So conflict is this thing that we create that creates a circular motion for us. We're always in it constantly. And if we don't learn that we're in conflict, we don't address conflict correctly, we're just going to maintain the chaos of conflict. So conflict comes with every type of relationship we have. If you look from personal to professional, conflict is always the one that impacts us the most. And it's what we do with conflict. We have to recognize there is conflict and be able to continue to think, then what do I do about it? Because otherwise you're going to be stuck in the chaos and the circle of conflict itself. Conflict wins. Conflict becomes what you do.
Oh, it's a lot to unpack. Conflict wins. How does conflict win? Does that come because we just ignore it? Pretend conflict doesn't exist? Like, how does conflict win? I assume if conflict wins, we lose, right?
Right. Conflict wins. It means it becomes the thing that dominates. It makes the choices for us versus us making the choices about conflict. So conflict, the way it wins is most of the time we avoid it. We act like it's not in the room. I always say to a lot of my clients, there's an elephant in this room and it's full of glitter. And no one's addressing the glittered elephant in the room. And I said, it's sitting in here with us and we can dance around it all day long, or we can start acknowledging what is actually in the room. And that's where conflict has power. It's what becomes bigger than the life and the people itself. And that's where we lose, because what it does is you and I have conflict. It's the third party in our relationship. And it has the power, which then pushes us further and further apart. And that's the same with our children. You know, when we have conflict becomes the third party in that relationship with your child. And what we most of the time do is either we try to overrun it or we avoid it. And conflict wins. We lose. The relationship is hurt. The pain is there. The hurt, the loss takes over.
2 questions off what you just said is, one, what does it look like to overrun conflict? I think everybody knows what it looks like to avoid it. You go to sleep and hope when you wake up tomorrow, the other person in the family has forgotten there's conflict and you just pretend that it doesn't exist, which maybe we'll get to in a second is unhappy. But what does it look like to overrun conflict? Let's tackle that one first. What does that look like?
I always think of it like football. You know, our son plays football, and I always think of like you're on the line, and instead of like taking your opponent and actually handling the situation, putting the person down on the ground like you're supposed to, you're just like pushing through. But what's happening is that person's pushing back at you. You're not really doing anything with them. You're just kind of like moving parts, and you're just shifting around your weight. And that overrun is the same thing with conflict. You're just running through it, pretending as if it wasn't there. You're still pretending. So you'll just push through and act like it's not there, and all you're doing is just pushing that conflict closer to the other person.
Who I assume is trying to push it back to you, right?
Or they're running, right? So that person's running because of conflict. And all you're doing is chasing them with the conflict. But the conflict is still always in between you. It never goes away unless we acknowledge it and decide we're going to do something with it.
So I still want to ask you the second thing, but now you've got me curious here, because I'm I'm with the rest of our church here. I'm trying to learn from an expert as well, even though, you and I are married. We have these conversations all the time, but I'm a learner, so I want to learn here as well. So tell me where I'm wrong here. If both people are pushing against the conflict without addressing it, just constantly kind of shoving it back and forth, that looks like a marriage that just, we fight all the time and don't even know what we're fighting about. And if one person's pushing it and the other person's running from it, then that's like the bully relationship, right? One person is always right, one person's always wrong, but they don't feel a lot of love in the house, I would imagine. And if two people run from it, then that marriage or whatever dynamic in the family, father, son, whatever it is, like I'd imagine that one probably feels pretty loveless.
Right. Imagine though, all the things that you just said, how exhausted is that? Just listening to you talk about how those things are handled at the conflict is exhausting. We're exerting our energy into the wrong space. Our emotions are energy. So then we're putting all of our energy, all of our emotions into this thing of conflict. And it's no longer about resolving the conflict. It's about winning and someone else losing. And that is painful. I mean, if you think about that with a relationship between a father and son,
yeah,
like who's going to really win?
Yeah.
No, that young boy grows up into a young man who grows up into a father maybe someday. And then he carries that same pain with him, which I meet him in my office 40 years later.
Yeah.
That is a story of the conflict winning because it created such pain for him as a young boy that he carried that into his young man life and into his own adulthood as a father. That's exhausting.
Yeah, I know Paul said during our last series, Bringing Honor Back, he said during I think it was week 2 of like pain that's not transformed is pain that's transmitted, right? And I always try to challenge myself. I don't know how well I do with it of, one day my son is going to grow up, my sons are going to grow up and they're going to be husbands like I am and they're going to be fathers like I am. And do I want that? And then my daughter's going to grow up one day and she's going to marry a man like me. And do I want that? And man, that's a weighty challenge. Let me circle back to the other things. I think it's a really big thing to ask. Always trying to come back to the why. Why do we avoid conflict? Is it fear? Do we feel like if I bring the conflict up, it's going to be a fight, so it's better to avoid it? Like why do most people avoid conflict, or I shove the conflict to you, which is done by I'm going to bring this issue up even though this isn't the issue, right? Because I'm just going to keep pushing the conflict. Like why do we do that?
I think the biggest thing of it is it comes down to one word that I tend to lean on is denial. Like denial is a great comfort to us. Like it's the reality of it is that we will deny the truth. We will remain in the darkness with what is going on in our lives because it feels more like comfort. And the reality of that is the reason we do that is because we fear what will come. We've created a new scenario of what reality will be if we address this versus actually looking at the truth. And so we think that if I address this conflict with my child, with my wife, if I address this conflict with this person, that we've already made a decision of what the outcome will be. And we also then have to recognize that we probably played a role. Like we think about it as a place of, well, they're going to be wrong. I'm always right.
Yeah.
Right? That's probably not true. There's probably truth on both sides. We just have to get to a place of understanding with one another. And understanding means we have to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And that is why we deny touching conflict.
To avoid the vulnerability. Yeah, that makes sense. So the next big question off the why is the how. I mean, obviously some people have, one of the reasons we even called this series Stuck Together is because we asked you, I asked you, what's the number one thing you hear when people come into your office? You're like, we feel stuck, is what people say a lot. So obviously there's a place you can get to where you're like, we got to go have a professional navigate whatever's going on in our family dynamic and our marriage dynamic, whatever it is. But if you're like, okay, our family's in a pretty good spot, but we want to grow here, or we've got some things we need to work on, how do we navigate conflict inside the home? How do we do that? What does that look like?
I think a lot of it starts with you first have to do your own emotional check-in.
Okay.
And I know emotions are like our favorite words, right? But we really have to do our own emotional check-in because when a situation arises where it's creating conflict, we have to understand first, like, what are we bringing into this? Like if I'm bringing anger into this, conflict, we might as well just push the pause button and go home. The reality of it is we have to have our own emotional check-in with it before we can go to someone else and say, how do you feel about this? Or what's going on with you? When we have our own vulnerability, we can allow space for someone else's vulnerability.
Hold on, say that again. That's really good.
If we can have our own vulnerability,
Yeah.
we can allow space for someone else to have their vulnerability. That's emotional safety.
That's scary though, right? Because what if you're vulnerable and the other person isn't?
And that is the risk of relationships. That's why we don't want to be vulnerable. So if we allow space for vulnerability within our families, if we teach our children that vulnerability is okay, like we have a young 7-year-old who he has lots of emotions.
He does.
He's the big emotion one of our family. But he has taught so many of us that vulnerability is okay.
Yeah.
Right? He has taught us that it's okay to have an emotion.
Yeah.
And the reality of that is we can have the emotion. It's just what are we doing with it? And that's where conflict comes, because we don't know what to do with our own emotions. So then we push that off on everyone else. If we just came to the space that we had vulnerability, they had vulnerability, and it was safe, emotionally safe, we can allow for transparency with one another, and it leads us to a place of curiosity with one another. And curiosity is that key component to addressing conflict.
Yeah.
You'll probably hear me talk about it in communication or anything else.
Yeah.
Curiosity is that place of openness. I'm coming to you. There's this conflict in the room. Let's see the glittered elephant here in the room. This is what I am feeling. I feel this. What's going on with you?
Yeah.
What brought this to us?
Yeah.
If we can do that, then we can look at it and say, this conflict probably wasn't as big as we made it.
Yeah.
It's no longer about the emotion. We've checked the emotion. It's about the real issue at hand.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I like that quite a bit. I know in my former life, when I was heavily involved in sales engineering and stuff like that, before we had any important conversations, we would talk about, or if I was training one of my sales guys, would talk to them and say, you need to set the upfront contracts at the start. It's a lot of simple stuff of, hey, can I ask you a hard question? And everyone's like, yes. And then you just got permission to ask the hardest question. So I wonder if we brought that same mentality into our families of, let's say I go to one of my sons and I'm just like, hey, can we both be vulnerable for a minute? And the answer 100% of the time is going to be yes. And then I'm going to be vulnerable, but there's an expectation that you're vulnerable back. Mm-hmm. Or if that make us feel a little bit more safe as we brought up vulnerability, because that's a scary word for a lot of people.
Well, and you're probably going to get from your teenage son an eye roll if you say, I'm going to be vulnerable, right?
Sure. Or from my 7-year-old son.
Your 7-year-old son, like that sounds silly.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is like most parents don't want to be vulnerable with their children because we think that we are failing them.
Yeah.
The reality is we're teaching them how to be successful.
Yeah.
And like if we can show we're vulnerable, we can say we were wrong, we can say we are sorry, we can say that we are hurt, we can say that we feel sad, that it's okay to have emotions with our children, that is going to decrease the conflict.
Yeah.
Most of the time, conflict is about a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Now, there can be some wrong choices and wrong behaviors in conflict. Most of the time, that is because it is a result of a misunderstanding within a situation.
Yeah.
And I had my feelings, you had yours, and we couldn't both have feelings. Only one feeling could be in the room.
Yeah.
And so that one's going to always be the dominant one.
Yeah, because it's not just concerning the issue, I'm right and you're wrong. It's my feelings are justified, your feelings are wrong. Feel the way I feel, even though your perception and everything is completely different, right?
I mean, depending on your child's personality.
Yeah.
Right? As
we have 3 very different children.
Right? And if you have one that is a little bit more timid or comes across as worried about other people, if they're an empath, right? If they own other people's emotions, they're going to be submissive to that.
Yeah.
And they're going to fall to your emotion in the room. That parent's going to feel that they won. And that child's going to be broken.
Well, that's, and I sometimes hate talking about my father, post-death for him, what is posthumously? What is that word? Is that the right word?
No, it's
posthumously after someone's passed away. Is that a word?
Sure.
Okay. Because I give him so much grace as a father now of, again, 3 very different kids and things like that. And I was definitely one of those people that felt like I was the perfect parent before I had kids, right? You know, you see other people's parenting fails and you're like, oh, I won't have parenting fails. Like, everyone who doesn't have kids is the best parent ever. But, you know, understanding that my dad's father passed away when he was 8, and then from 8 to 16, he lived with like 17 other family members. And at 16, bought his first house, the house I grew up in. So a lot of us parent, I think, from a place of, I liked that my parents did this, so I will do that. I don't like that my parents did this, so I won't do that. And giving my dad the grace of not having any of that. He didn't know what was right or what was wrong. He had no example. You know, 17 different random family members, felt the need to make money and buy a house, you know, at 16 years old. He was just trying to define, I think, success for himself. So my brother and I we were in church, but not believers at all. You know, I mean, you obviously know my story and Brad's story of just it wasn't just that we weren't believers. Like, we were both arrested multiple times. Brad spent time in prison. I was in, you know, some AA programs as a teenager, just a lot of messy stuff. And my dad parented from a place of just discipline, where emotions were not tolerated, vulnerability felt weak. And then later in life, we, you know, had some good conversations around that. It's all he knew was just to parent the behavior. And I think early on for us as parents, you probably saw that in me. We've never had this conversation, but you probably saw that in me of trying to parent the behavior of, if I can get the behavior that I want, I think I'm successful as a parent. But like you said, depending on the kid's personality, you know, that probably worked for my sister. She's probably more empathetic and owned that she was wrong. My brother and I pushed back on it. So we just learned, well, I got to be better at not getting caught at some of this stuff. So I think the vulnerable conversations for me in my childhood probably would have been wildly impactful, but vulnerability was seen and taught as weak. So we just leaned heavily into, my father leaned heavily into just the discipline. So it was, I will punish until I get the behavior that I want. And if I see the behavior that I want, I know I'm doing this well, right? Like, do you see that? Is that a common thing? Is that a cultural thing? Are we losing that with the next generation, or is that just being passed on over and over and over again?
It's going to tap into a lot of the other episodes even that you were talking about. But
Okay.
that family of origin, I mean, that's one of my favorite topics. I love talking about family of origin. Not because there's someone to blame, but it's a place of just understanding ourselves, right? No one's perfect.
Yeah.
And so the reality of it is that most of the time, if I have a teen or a family or a kid in therapy, a lot of times parents, there's a behavior that they have identified that doesn't fit something, or they have anxiety, different types of things. We're trying to fix that behavior, right? When I talk to families, I'm like, I'm about recovery. I'm not about fixing a symptom. And so that key component is, yes, there's probably anxiety there. Yes, there's probably they're acting out, or they're starting to use drugs. They're starting to have these behaviors that parents don't want, which creates conflict, right?
Yeah.
But all we can see is the behavior. We don't see the root as to the reason these things started to occur.
Yeah.
If you think about behavior, right? A little toddler in the room, the toddler can't communicate what's going on in their inside of them most of the time. The reality of that is that creates then conflict for them. And that conflict then comes out in behaviors, right? So they're trying to explain to you that they are having conflict, but they don't have the words and language to use it the way we're supposed to, right?
Right.
But the reality of it is that that behavior is about something else. And if we can learn to understand that conflict is really when we start to see behaviors, avoidance. We see people deny, we see people withdraw, we see tendency for aggression, right? Aggression can become a part of conflict because we go one way or the other. We usually go to avoidance or we go to aggression. The reality of that is that we are forgetting what was the root reason we all started doing this.
Yeah.
And that is the key of vulnerability. And that is when families can start to heal and recover, is when they're okay to get messy.
Yeah.
They're okay to have feelings. They're okay to feel the pain with it. They're okay to walk through it. And because they realize that in order for us to get here, we have to detangle all of this.
Yeah.
And you're probably going to have feelings that I'm not going to understand. And that can be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Just give maybe a couple little pastoral advice tips here for the church, and then we can close out with maybe something tangible. But I know this is more than 10 years ago, you and I were in an argument, and I go into win mode. I think I've grown over the last 15 years, but I want to win the argument. I remember in the middle of the argument, you said to me, "You're mean." And in the moment, I'm like, well, that isn't, stay on task here, Tina. We're having a battle here, and you come from over here. You're just like, "You're mean," and you were done with the argument. And I had to wrestle with that. And this whole idea of when you're dealing with conflict, when you're having a conversation, and it starts from a place of disagreement. When you're speaking, are you speaking to help, or are you speaking to wound? Mm-hmm. And you can see that your spouse or one of your kids has done something wrong. And I'm sure I have your full permission, as you have mine, to challenge you. If I feel like there's an area of, say, your spirituality where you're off course a little bit, to challenge. But when you push back against someone in your family, or you decide like, okay, we're going to engage some conflict here, are you speaking to heal, to build up, to restore? Or are the words you start to use words to wound? And it reminds me of Proverbs, where it says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Mm-hmm. So my advice to you as a church family would be, if one of your kids comes to you, or your spouse comes to you, and they say something that feels like it stings, in that moment, you have a choice. A soft answer turns away wrath and allows for a healthy discussion, right? But a harsh word stirs up anger. And then my guess would be, after you have a few fights, that's when you go to conflict avoidance. We don't know how to manage conflict, so we'll just avoid it. And that'll be healthier. And it's not, right?
Right.
I want to give people something tangible to do. So obviously we're preaching on these topics, and then we wanted to do this podcast to kind of supplement. And then I asked you for some book recommendations. So I think for this one, you recommended a book called Boundaries, which is Townsend. I don't know his first name.
Townsend.
He actually wrote several of them, didn't he? Because I think I read Kids with Boundaries.
He's written a book about boundaries with every person out there in the world.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. So if you're curious, if you want to be challenged, if you want to take another tangible step, run to Amazon, type in Townsend Boundaries, and the different books will pop up. And then engage some healthy conflict this week in your marriage and in your family. And we'll see you in another week for the next topic. So thank you very much for being a part of this. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Take care.